Revenge. It's one of the most primal instincts we have as humans. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We learn early in our lives that revenge is often not the best path to take, even if we feel it's justified. The cycle it feeds is corrosive and harms those around us. It's here where we find ourselves with The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog's latest foray into the story-driven single-player genre of games. The original game was something of a revelation for me. While I wouldn't call it a masterpiece by any means, it was one of the first games that truly demonstrated to me that characters can grow in realistic manners, allowing you to connect to them in some way. Though to be fair, my previous story-driven experience was Halo, where Master Chief has the personality of a wet sponge. I never expected a sequel to this game, and what I really didn't expect was a handful of ideas with only strings to tie them together. The Last of Us Part 2 dropped the ball, and it is one of my biggest disappointments of this generation. Just a side note, there's a lot to unpack in discussing how and why The Last of Us Part 2 is a step back in many facets. In discussing and reviewing this game, I will enter into spoiler territory quite a lot, and in an effort to remain respectful to people that don't wish to have the game spoiled for them, spoilers will be clearly marked ahead of time and there will be timestamps on screen that you can skip to. With that out of the way, let us truly explore what is the befuddled mess known as The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us was more than just a fantastical tale across a virus-ravaged America. It was a deep, cleverly crafted character drama which focused on the themes of growth and familial bonds that can exist between people which you wouldn't expect. Even though the world itself was dark and grim, the tale of Joel and Ellie was a bright and promising one. These two characters who started at odds grew to love and care for one another in such a realistic manner. It perfectly complemented the us versus them structure of the world when meeting the other factions and groups of people. While allies and enemies came and went, Joel and Ellie were the only constants in each other's lives. To work as a potentially beautiful juxtaposition to the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 sees Ellie go down the dark, cyclical road of anger, hatred, and revenge. Joel's actions have come back to haunt him. It's here where the vicious cycle begins. Abby seeks revenge for her father's abrupt death at the hands of Joel, and she tracks him down from Seattle all the way to Jackson, a relatively large settlement or town amongst the dense forest. And once the two collide, Abby ends his life. There's no beating around the bush. This scene is gritty and raw, and it sets the tone for the rest of the game. It's just a shame that the game never truly realizes how to handle that tone. Before anyone can misconstrue my words, let me get something clear. I actually really like the tonal direction of this sequel. There's no rule that games have to have heroes, and there is no rule that games have to be fun. Where my issue lies in The Last of Us Part 2 is with its writing and pacing. Naughty Dog has always had a knack for using its anemic gameplay as a form of pacing in its games. A great example is with the Uncharted games. As things draw to a close, you find yourself in the combat side of gameplay more and more frequently. The Last of Us Part 2 features similar pacing through its gameplay, but in a much more intimate fashion. Trying to take notes from games like God of War and Gears 5, Ellie's latest adventure spends quite a while in an open area, affording the player a great sense of agency and choice, while also using the slower gameplay and exploration to create some incredible world building. It's here where the strength of The Last of Us Part 2 lies. The game uses this downtime to also try and create a cool bond between you and the characters you travel with, but this is where the writing really felt clunky, cumbersome, and oxymoronic. As I mentioned previously, this game is positioned in a way so that there are no heroes. It's telling a dark tale where you aren't supposed to like or relate to the key characters in any way. Yet when you're traveling the world with the other characters, they try to tell you their backstory so you can relate to them and like them. Now, Naughty Dog has always done a great job with their character interactions and progression. It's what made the original game so great. However, it seems like creating characters that you aren't supposed to like isn't exactly their forte. Unfortunately, the awkward interactions and dialogue that occur during your traversal through its open area almost immediately derail the standard of storytelling that is set by the game's introductory sequences. A strong start doesn't mean a strong finish. This is without even going into the actual events of the game's story, which largely revolve around Ellie and her extraordinarily poor decision making. From chasing people down that would be able to beat the living daylights out of her without breaking a sweat, to completely abandoning a friend who needs help in order to fulfill a selfish revenge promise for a person she didn't even like all that much to begin with. All her actions and motives are so frustratingly boneheaded that I can only describe the story as a disaster piece that I couldn't avert my eyes from. This is all without getting into the most divisive section of the game, and whether you love or hate this game depends entirely on this section. About halfway through the game, you assume control of Abby, the character whom the game has been trying to demonize this entire time, in an attempt to make you understand her story. Clunky dialogue aside, which is consistent across the majority of the game, the biggest issue with this section is it answers questions that no one really asked nor cared for, while also making you play with bad, almost typecast characters. The sarcastic, cocky white male, the perverted Latino drunkard, and the mildly sensitive pregnant woman, as well as some other rather inconsequential characters, are all there, and they're all so predictable and boring. These characters are just used as vessels to throw around random plot points that are never properly used most of the time. You'll effectively spend 10 hours or so in campaign sections which add so little to the character's depth and story that it may as well have been communicated through a cutscene rather than making the game 10 hours longer than it needed to be. To make things worse, in keeping with the low bar of quality that is put forth in this section, the end of this section is met with one of the most terrible boss fights I've played in a game, and I've done the Uncharted 2 final boss. Even the ending of the game, which happens after this, is a mess in and of itself, and extends the game by an additional hour or two for a climax that fumbles its tonal juxtaposition and tries to express themes that come off as pretentious due to how poorly communicated they are. There's no true tonal build to the choices made in the ending, making it feel clumsy with yet another random plot point to cap off a game already laden with random irrelevant plot points. So if the story is balked, you'd hope that they've at least majorly improved the gameplay, right? Yeah, don't hold your breath. Naughty Dog's gameplay has never been great. I'd even go as far as calling Uncharted's gameplay as aggressively mediocre. But The Last of Us had a certain element of agency in its gameplay. It was definitely far from perfect, but the stealth and choice-based gameplay was surprisingly gratifying, and it conveyed a really effective horror vibe. Most of The Last of Us Part 2 betrays this design idea through Ellie's Switchblade. Now, Ellie did have her Switchblade during the Left Behind story DLC, but that was also trying to tell a relatively short story without impeding anything through its gameplay. This sequel, however, is spread across many hours, and the gameplay becomes one of the most important factors over the course of the game. To put it bluntly, the Switchblade ruins the tension in the gameplay, especially with the clickers. Taking these infected enemies out is nothing short of trivial, and fighting the human enemies is just laborious. The AI is pretty dumb and has a delayed sense of object permanence, with hunters looking for me in spots where I was hiding minutes ago. The only time the AI felt somewhat competent was with the dogs, where they can pick up on your scent trail and track you down, the only point where gameplay felt like it had been improved. The jump button felt pretty useless, and what the game lacks in terms of gameplay quality, it doesn't make up for in environmental puzzles. Part of what made the first game so enjoyable was the fact that it quite often sidelined its gameplay and combat, and instead opted to throw some interesting and engaging environmental puzzles your way. From positioning debris so Ellie can cross, to finding objects to use as ladders and elevation tools, The Last of Us's best moments reside within the sections that ignore the conventional gameplay standards for an action-adventure game. This sequel forgets all of that. Most environmental puzzles revolve around throwing rope, with admittedly cool mechanics, and moving a dumpster into a very easy to discern position. It's such wasted potential for such a beautiful environment, and it's just another problem amongst a list of problems that plague this game. Ultimately, as the game dragged out more and more, I found myself growing increasingly tired of its gameplay that was already dated when it originally took the stage in 2013. time has not been kind to The Last of Us 2's gameplay, and neither has Naughty Dog. It got to the point where I would just run through the final areas of the game just to get the game over and done with. The game also introduces a new faction in what is effectively the last 10% of the game, without even so much as an explanation for who these people are, adding yet another random plot point that feels completely irrelevant to the list. Where The Last of Us Part 2 finds itself carried the most is through its presentation. This speaks for both the narrative presentation and the readjusted framing of the combat. Everything is a lot more cinematic in an effort to mask glaring faults, while also attempting to transcend the idea of being a game and instead being so much more, which only serves to make it feel like a generic video game with sloppy, inconsistent writing. Animations are crisp and the sound design is excellent. There are some small details which are both haunting and incredible, like hearing people choke on their own blood after slitting their throat. The only detail I hated was that every time you kill a human, NPCs will respond by yelling random names like Rachel, as if they were connected in some way. In somewhat of a contrast to this, however, the AI can also tell when your gun is out of ammo and will call it if they hear your gun clicking. These little details, which don't add to the mess that is the story, is where I found myself loving The Last of Us Part 2. In addition to the overall presentation, the visuals of this sequel are a cut above the rest. The first game felt like it was the transition between two generations of consoles. This game, honestly, it feels like a next generation game. There is some serious technology powering this game. A standout moment is a scene where Ellie has her back to the camera and she takes off her shirt. There is no clipping of the hair through the shirt, and the physics are all perfectly in check and behave exactly how you would expect them to in real life. This would have been incredibly tough to do, and I found myself mesmerized just at the sheer quality of the game in this regard. I previously regarded Gears 5 and Doom Eternal as perhaps the best games of this generation in terms of raw visual fidelity and optimization, but The Last of Us Part 2 is in a league of its own. It's definitely not a perfect, bug-free game, but it's pretty damn close. What works well with this technology is the overall level design. The general flow and design of The Last of Us Part 2's levels and combat arenas is significantly improved and feels much more organic. Where the original's design was quite regimented and video gamey, this sequel understood how an organic flow in its level design can complement the world design, much in the same way that art can carry its own story. You see towns and city districts in ruins, and you can immediately see exactly how they collapsed. There is absolutely no denying that this game is an improvement on that front, and it is part of what allowed me to enjoy the world as much as I did. The Last of Us Part 2 is the result of handing a blank check to a prestigious studio and not ensuring that what they are working on functions cohesively. While there are a lot of improvements in this sequel compared to its predecessor, in terms of visuals, sound, level design and overall presentation, there are a lot of missteps that hold the game back significantly. Problems such as clunky dialogue, dated gameplay, sloppy and inconsistent writing, and pointless storytelling that adds nothing compelling yet extends what should be a 15-hour game to a 25-hour game, are all prevalent issues in The Last of Us Part 2. Once all these issues combine, they serve to create a game which feels more like a proof of concept or a tech demo, rather than a compelling exploration of themes such as revenge, anger, and the duplicitous nature of humans in a world where governments and laws no longer exist. To say that I was disappointed in this game is an understatement.